welcome everyone to this afternoon's UK-ICN seminar series meeting, and welcome to people from the UK and overseas. So we've got two fantastic talks lined up for you today. Just a reminder to everyone that these are recorded and that they'll go onto YouTube, onto our YouTube channel afterwards. So just bear that in mind with any questions and sharing your video during the presentations. So so we've got two speakers, Diana Bell from the University of East Anglia in Norwich, and then Alan Sulcic from University of Ljubljana. I hope that's right, Alan. So first off will be Diana Bell, who's going to talk to us about One Health lessons from SARS. So Diana did her PhD at the University of Cardiff, and like I said, is now in Norwich, where she's a professor of conservation biology. So her research covers a wide range of areas, from the restoration of critically endangered birds and mammals to illegal wildlife trade. And she's worked on an array of emerging infectious pathogens, all the way from flagellar, I guess, to more recently monkeypox virus. So she was one of the first to highlight illegal wildlife trade as a possible source of the first SARS epidemic, and more recently has collaborated with Andrew Cunningham and Miles Cowell's groups to identify one of the first sarbecaviruses in UK horseshoe bats, which was published last year in scientific reports. So I'll hand over to you, Diana, and I'll just be in the background if you need anything. So we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. I'll start straight into the talk, if that's okay. But you might hear strange noises in the background. That's my dog snoring or eating the legs of the desk. Okay, so in this slide, we can see. Go back to the first slide. In the what we have here are civets that have been culled during the outbreak of SARS-CoV 20 years ago in China. Next slide, please. Okay, so we all know this, but we'll just run through it quickly. SARS-CoV-1 was the first new severe infectious disease of the 21st century. Index cases we know was in Guangdong, southern China, November 2002. About 8,500 cases in 29 countries, with a mortality of 11%. And the cause was this new coronavirus, SARS-CoV. So there were early indications that this might have animal origins, in that some of the early cases, many of the early cases, were people who worked or lived around the wildlife market in Guangdong. And Iguan went down from University of Hong Kong to sample the animals in the market, and he found SARS-like coronaviruses in 3 small carnivore species: Mars palm civet, raccoon dog, and Chinese ferret badgers. And these represent 3 families of carnivores. So we've got on the left, we've got the viverids, in the middle we've got the canids, and on the right we've got the mustelids. Next slide. Now, the early control focused in China, focused on culling farmed civets, lots of civet farms, farming them for meat, civet coffee and other products, and traditional Chinese medicine in China. I just happened to have a PhD student working on civets in neighboring Vietnam and the wildlife trade, in fact. And we said, we think you're looking in the wrong place. You need to be looking at the wildlife trade. Next slide, please. So this is Scott Robertson, who was studying a range of small carnivores, but particularly civets. And this just shows some of the wildlife trade routes at that time. we knew existed. And you can see the wildlife trade coming out of Laos, and indeed in Cambodia. Let's focus on Laos, and it's going up through Hanoi as a hub and into southern China, and some of it's going into Thailand. Next slide, please. And so we asked whether the animal reservoir for SARS extended outside China. Had it come in through the wildlife trade route? Next. Where we had similar wildlife markets mixing the same species in several countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. Next slide. And we highlighted the need to screen possible host species at different stages in this wildlife trade route system. So to screen them in the wild, and then in different stages of the transportation system, whilst they're being mixed with a range of other taxa. So you get all sorts of things being thrown in the back of a van, from porcupines to pythons to civets. Next slide, please. I think, and this is a photograph of Scott Robertson, who now works at WCS. Okay, and next one, please. So we were asked to talk at the Lessons from SARS conference, Royal Society, in 2004, and this was published, and the next slide, please, and the next one. We actually found that, well, we didn't do it, but another team actually found that we were right. In the civet farmers tested antibody negative for SARS, but the wildlife market traders tested positive for SARS antibodies. Next slide. And we talked in that lecture about the conservation implications of this situation, where we have a severe depletion of wildlife. There's in Indo-Burma hotspot for biodiversity, meaning lots of endemics and lots of species. And indeed, wildlife trade has been shown to be a greater threat than deforestation to wildlife to biodiversity in Southeast Asia. And there's a rather long conclusion here, but essentially we're asking for a One Health approach. Just that last sentence, you can read this when this goes online, but we need to address the dual threats to the long-term future of biodiversity, including man, requires a less anthropocentric approach, more interdisciplinary approach to problems that require the combined research expertise of ecologists, conservation biologists, veterinarians, epidemiologists, biologists, as well as human health professionals. So a one health approach. Next slide. So let's look at the causes and conservation implications. In the last 30 or so years in Vietnam and now PDR, we've seen a shift from subsistence hunting, where the males are going out to hunt to feed the family, to selling that wildlife, selling that wildlife into an illegal wildlife trade system. And these are sold as live animals, unlike the bushmeat in Africa, for example, or the wildlife indeed in South America. And it's become more expensive than domestic animals for people to buy. It's seen as a luxury or a medicinal item. So if businessmen or women want to impress impress their colleagues, they take them out for a wildlife restaurant. And with increased affluence in the region, we've seen this increase to an international trade, multi-billion international trade and organised crime links. So it's the same people that are involved in drug smuggling, people smuggling, and all sorts of other nasty activities. Next slide, please. And the consequence is this severe depletion of wildlife from civets, different reptiles, pigs, muntjac, deer, pangolins, and porcupine. We were the first to work on pangolin, by the way. Next slide, please. What we said in that talk was that this created the perfect storm for the emergence of new zoonotic diseases. So this shift from 100% local consumption, so if people in the family got sick or even died, that might go overlooked. But when you've got the shift to the sale of that wildlife to international trade, of course you've got an expansion of the distances being moved over. You've got the extensive mixing of different taxa, different species and pathogens in that trade. And as you get depletion of one population of a species, you get a shift to exploiting new populations. And so it's kind of spreading out like a fungus. And of course, this includes the pet trade, as well as trade for consumption and TCM, Chinese medicine. Next slide, please. So when SARS-CoV-2 appeared in January 2000, I was really angry. Wrote a piece for the conversation. The Wuhan virus, we still haven't learned the lessons from SARS. And I've been reading the ProMeds, and they were suggesting that the source was environmental specimens from the wildlife section of the Wuhan seafood market, were 100% identical to SARS-CoV-2. With others, I called for a ban on wildlife trade and farming, and emphasised that it was crucial other countries involved in the wildlife trade chain, such as Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and now immediately follow suit with this ban, as they possess the same markets and restaurants. And that is the demand wasn't only fueled by China, but also for domestic consumption within those countries. And I'll just mention here that colleagues of Scott's at WCS, Hung et al., actually did what we wanted to do, which following testing the animals in the wild and then at different stages in the trade system, and they found an increasing amount of coronavirus in wildlife as we went from the wild to point of human consumption in Vietnam. Next slide, please. So, global. There's actually been a global expansion of wildlife trade since SARS-CoV-1, not a decrease, and that has been in the form of expanding into online trade. We're now seeing African and South American fauna going to China and Southeast Asia, which wasn't happening before, and African pangolins are now in that trade, which only the Asian pangolins are being exploited, but now the African pangolins have had it as well. We've got situations like the South American jaguar and African lion bones, leg bones are replacing Asian tiger bones in traditional Chinese medicine. And even during the COVID lockdowns, confiscations of wildlife were being reported at borders, international borders. There was one particular one, a huge one, of South American fauna en route to China that was intercepted in Mexico City airport. So China did announce a ban after in February 2020 on trade. Next slide, please. And Scott sent me 2 slides that his WCS colleagues in China had written in trying to explain what this involved, this ban. And this is known as the 2020 February decision. And essentially, the Chinese government issued a decision to comprehensively prohibit the illegal trade of wild animals, to eliminate the bad habits of wild animal consumption and protect the health and safety of people. It prohibits the hunting, trade, transportation, and consumption of all terrestrial, not aquatic, wildlife species, such as food, species as food, whether wild sourced or captive bred in farms, except for those, so there's another caveat, for those listed on the National Livestock and Poultry Genetic Resource List. So a number of animals have been banned for consumption as food. Next slide, please. And Zhang Yang and WCS in China, they did research into public opinion and so on, and they asked whether now China has ended the commercial trade of wildlife, of wild birds and mammals for human consumption. And actually, they concluded that it has changed dramatically in China, and that there's been no opposition to this ban in China, but the livestock catalogue exemptions still maintains a loophole, which needs monitoring. Then they ask, are we secure from zoonotic disease risks that arise from the food consumption of wild animals? And they showed, or they highlighted the fact that current laws in China still legalize wildlife trade for pet traditional Chinese medicine, which will include civets and a whole bunch of other animals, and their consumption, for fur and for research and biomedical purposes. Chinese consuming wild birds and mammals outside of China may rise as international travel resumes. So this would be in the neighbouring countries where absolutely zero legislative changes have occurred. So the food consumption of wildlife has not disappeared in the region. Thank you. Next slide. So wildlife farming is actually has been expanding since SARS-CoV-2 in the last couple of years appeared. And we actually worked on, this is a porcupine stuck in a horrible cage under horrible conditions. And we looked at the conservation impact of the commercial farming of porcupines in Vietnam back in 2010. And we showed that actually all these farmers were doing was laundering animals from the wild. They weren't breeding them, and they were selling. They were just catching them in the wild, selling them to other farms. So this was this was depleting the wild population. I can tell you about why they consume it later. But there is a real appetite for wildlife farming as a source of revenue at the moment, unfortunately, in these other countries. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the beginning, how am I doing for time? Because I haven't got my.
You've got a couple of minutes left, Diana.
Okay, well, I'll just run through these. So this was the work that Andrew Cunningham and I decided that we should be screening UK horseshoe bats for SARS-like coronavirus back during the pandemic. And I happen to have an undergraduate student, Ivana Murphy, who was working for a bat consultancy and who had access to samples, fecal samples, and we collaborated with Miles Carroll and his team at Porton and Oxford University, and Jack Crook, a PhD student at the time, was leading the genetics of the genetic analysis. So Ivana collected the samples, and Jack and other colleagues at Porton and Oxford did the genetic analysis. And what this found was the first SARS-like sarbecovirus in UK horseshoe bats. This was RHGB01 at the top. And it clustered with a sample, a sarbecovirus that had been collected from a bat in Bulgaria in 2008. Those in green are the SARS-CoV-2 viruses, and those in red are the SARS-CoV-1 viruses or SARS-like viruses. Next slide, please. And then in the last 2 weeks, well, actually, no, I'll just mention that we were sampling animals right at the west of their global distribution of the species, the lesser horseshoe bat. And they occur in the southwest only of the UK. And shortly after our paper, a paper appeared published by some Russians who'd sampled the species, the lesser horseshoes, and the far eastern part of its range. And they'd found 2 new sarbecoviruses, which they hadn't seen in our paper, and so they didn't do a comparison, cluster 1 and cluster 2 in greater and lesser horseshoe bats. But there are 85 species of horseshoe bats with a huge distribution across the world. And it just shows that we shouldn't only be looking in Southeast Asia for these new SARS-like viruses. Next slide, please. And as you'll have seen, there have been 2 papers published in the last couple of weeks doing more sampling of horseshoe bats in the UK. But the first by APA, Journal of General Virology, on the 14th of June, sampled loads of lesser horseshoes and greater horseshoes at a number of different sites, found a high percentage of sarbecoviruses in individual and pool samples of lessers, but found none in the greaters. Luckily found no evidence of SARS-CoV spillover into any of those bats, but widespread sarbecovirus infection in lessers across the UK. Next slide, please. So here's the phylogenetic tree, and they sequenced 5 of these species of these viruses, and you can see it's clustering with RHGB01 ours there in red. Next slide, please. And then the other paper is by Cedric Town et al. And they looked at a large number of bat species, only 48 samples, but a large number of species, 16. And they also found they found sarbecoviruses in two in Greater Horseshoe, and 2 in Lesser Horseshoes, and those would be 7 and 8. So actually, I took this from the preprint when they didn't know about the other paper. So anyway, we've got 4. We're all clustering with ours, but I hadn't seen one other. But importantly, they claimed that one of those viruses, one of those sarbecoviruses, could bind to human ACE2 cell and use it for cell entry in vitro. Next slide, please. So our fieldwork stopped on SARS-CoV-2 because we went straight from SARS-CoV-2 in Vietnam to H5N1, and that's what we've been working on as well. Next slide, please. And it came to us. Next slide, please. And the next one. And the next one. And the next one. Sorry. We're coming to the end. Essentially, 3 Alston civets died in an Alston's conservation program. These were animals that had been rescued from the trade. They're endangered in the wild, and the program was run by Scott. And when they did the post-mortem, it looked like they described it as a severe acute respiratory disease. We contacted Malik Paris on the right there in Hong Kong, and I asked him to screen them for SARS and H5N1, because we knew there was SARS. The H5N1 was in the local poultry farms, and they tested positive for H5N1 genotype G. Next slide, please. And we published that on a list of all the other bird species and mammals that had been tested positive at the time for H5N1. Next, last slide. So I took this quotation from WHO recently from 2023, where they talk about the extent of the outbreak of H5N1 in Europe, in poultry, captive birds, and in wild birds. And of course, there've been predictions that this will be the next human pandemic. I mean, it was already we've already had a form that killed humans back in the early noughties. And just this week, in fact, the ProMed I read this morning, we're up to 20 dead cats from H5N1 right the way across Poland, which needs looking into to see what genotype that is. We also got a new virus, Langa virus, a novel Henipavirus, which is causing human cases in China. It comes from shrews. And Oz virus, a novel Sarbecovirus, tick-borne virus, finds human fatality in Japan just this week. So this underlines the One Health interdisciplinary research need. Thank you.